Hello. My podcast normally focuses on resettlement, so leaving the armed forces, mindset, and motivation. But I thought I would shift gears slightly and talk or dive a bit further into people that spark my interest in the agile space. So this is going to be both on YouTube and the audio will be on the podcast also. But today I am speaking to Mr. Chris Stone, aka the virtual agile coach. Now, for those of you in the agile community, you might have seen this guy pop up, not out of nowhere necessarily. Obviously, he's been doing great things for a long time, but I don't know, recently it seems to have ramped up. So I thought I always like to hear other people's motivations behind sharing content or their experiences, or I don't know, prodding the wasp's nest. And I think he has done that a few times. So yeah, good evening, Chris.
Good evening, Jack. Yeah, thanks for having me on your podcast.
No problem. Thanks for coming on. So yeah, different format, but for those watching, listening, what's the helicopter version of Chris Stone?
So the helicopter version of me, and there is a very clear rationale and reason why I guess I've popped up a little bit more recently. So I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But I'm someone with about 8 years experience in agile ways of working. I began my career in a large consultancy in a very command and control environment, very, very waterfall. And at the time that made sense to me. You know, it made sense that there was rigor and control around what we were doing, and it was tightly coupled a commercial environment. So being in charge of budgets and scope and those sorts of things just made sense. But I basically got my first exposure to agile working for this large consultancy, and it was on a large program for Network Rail, so in the transport and logistics industry in the UK. And there was 3 work streams to this project that I was managing. One was refactoring a back-end system that was a bit of a monolith. There was another work stream focused on designing a replacement system for the future. And the third work stream was designing a new mobile front end. And that mobile front end was being delivered in Agile. I remember this disconnect at the time, this cognitive dissonance on my part, where I was being asked by my management, I need your Gantt chart, I need you to show me in control, I want your status reports and all those sorts of things. And I had this lead developer for this third party called Shebin, who was basically running things in Scrum. And I was asking him, can I know when this is going to be ready, Sheb? And he said, oh, well, we're working in sprints. And we had to sit down and try and work through that. And I had understood what Agile was from university, but this was my first practical experience with it. And it made sense to me. Why wouldn't you want to deliver things more frequently, iterate upon them, learn quickly? And I was basically sold on Agile ever since. I then basically began doing more Scrum Mastery type roles. I joined Accenture, another consultancy. And then began going into kind of transformation. So I went self-employed for a while, and I'm currently working for Rank Interactive in the UK as a delivery manager. Not a title I particularly subscribe to, but I consider myself more of an agile coach. And the whole virtual agile coach thing was born because for the past 2 or 3 years, that's exactly what I've been doing, coaching agility virtually across multiple time zones, multiple geographies. And it kind of became what I was good at. And with obviously the current situation at the moment with COVID, the fact that the technology is enabling more distributed working, the virtual agile coach became my brand.
And have you always, again, apologies for my ignorance, but we've met virtually. I think this is the second time. So I think we've got a pretty good rapport. So you'll understand when I ask this question. Were you always posting stuff on LinkedIn, or let's call it what it is, marketing yourself beforehand on other platforms, or was it a steady sort of ramp up, or did you just wake up one day and go, I want to share a bit more of my experience?
Yeah, so here comes the story then. So the reality is, and I have to bring it down a little bit to a sadder note, a few months ago in the summer, during this obviously COVID situation, I was diagnosed with depression. And one of my creative outlets, one of my ways of distracting myself from it was creativity, was designing and sharing my knowledge. Now, reading books like Leaders Eat Last from Simon Sinek, and he's talking about the chemicals in your brain, and you've got kind of dopamine and serotonin and all those sorts of things. And one of the things that is recommended to try and improve depressive situations is serotonin, so helping others. So for me, there was obviously a huge ramp up in my sharing of content, driven by one of my coping mechanisms for my depression. One of my ways of getting more mentally healthy was practicing mindfulness, but also sharing content with others. I believed I had a lot of knowledge that I could share. I've got a very confident persona. I don't mind making a fool of myself or doing silly things or trying experiments and failing miserably. And I just went for it. And I kind of started small, doing certain things. It started getting good responses. People were asking for more of it. And therefore, I've basically now got a content calendar that spans the next few months of things that I plan to do and share.
Cool. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. So did it have any negative impacts? Did it sort of impact you negatively in any way as you've been going through this?
In
Because
terms
it can be, because it can be, well, in mental health, it can be a bit of a minefield out there sometimes.
Yeah.
In terms of people not disagreeing, because that's what we want, right? And we want that healthy debate, but sometimes the lines get crossed. And we're all human. If we don't really like people saying they don't like what we're saying. Do you know what I mean? Did that impact your mental health at any point?
No, not at all. And I think the reason for that is my brand of mental health issues are more relating to emotional numbness than any particular sadness or anything to that effect. So I'm kind of shielded a little bit from any negativity, really. It doesn't particularly bother me. But at the same time, as you were just saying there, I'm someone who actively encourages people to disagree with me. I gave a talk at a remote meetup a few weeks ago, and it was titled "The Agile Manifesto Needs to Change my mind." So I go in there and I encourage people to dissent, to suggest other things, because I don't ever want a situation where people don't feel they can safely challenge or can safely disagree or have healthy conflict. Nobody wants homophily where everyone thinks exactly the same way. So I actively encourage it in everything I do.
Cool. And what's been your biggest source of content at the moment? In terms of, you mentioned the Agile Manifesto there. I've seen certification has been something you've brought to the table. Dehumanizing or humanizing the workplace, which I have got a separate question to ask. Sure. Not that I disagree with it, but when you posted something, I thought, that's interesting. So I'll draw back around to that. Yeah, what's been the fuel of your content over the past?
I think those themes mostly cover it. At the moment, I guess what I'm doing is I'm seeing, hearing, observing dysfunction, and I'm not afraid to call it out and just challenge it. An example of that being obviously the manifesto. My whole ethos around the manifesto is it's a fantastic historical document. It served a great purpose. It was revolutionary in its time, but at the same time, it was something that was produced by 17 white middle-class software engineers, all male, and therefore doesn't represent a diverse lens through which you could look through. And that doesn't mean it's wrong, but it just means it could be better. And we haven't really, as a community of practitioners, performed that activity. A few people have created different versions of manifestos, but we've not really done a retrospective on the manifesto itself. And I think the challenge is that a lot of people almost see it as this dogmatic, holy Bible sort of situation. Thou shalt not question the Agile Manifesto. Well, actually, if we're really being agile about it, we're talking in the manifesto about continuously verifying whether what we're doing is right. And we haven't really meaningfully, as a community, sat down and said, is it right for us in this year, 2020?
Yeah, I agree. One thing I've noticed, though, is that half the people, well, the majority of people, third time, 99% of people talking about the Agile Manifesto had nothing to do with it. You never see the authors saying anything about it in my network anyway. Obviously they do speak about it, but I don't know. A lot of people seem to talk about it. The Scrum Master title, again, being another thing that people are talking about at the moment. So many people talking about it who have no real links to it or have no influence to ever change it. And I worry sometimes that we get focused on these things instead of actually just doing the stuff. Because the customer ultimately doesn't care about the Agile Manifesto, right?
And this is exactly why what I was saying is I see dysfunction and I challenge it, because I think I'm seeing and hearing a lot of people talking about it, lamenting the situation, but not actively doing anything about it. So what I'm doing is going out to these talks, these meetups. I'm encouraging people to say, right, let's do something about it. So I'm currently actively looking for a forum, a good forum in which to perform an experiment, a retrospective on the Agile Manifesto. Let's just practice what we preach. and perform that experiment. Let's consider whether it's still fit for purpose. There are lots of alternatives out there. There could be some language changes. There's some fundamental things that are perhaps missing from the manifesto, like psychological safety, which we've learned in the past 20 years is very important in creating environments of trust. We've got the fact that our current working world is far more distributed than it is co-located. And is that something that needs to be altered and reflected in the manifesto? There's lots of things that could be tweaked. I'm not saying it needs a wholesale change, but we should at least verify whether it still serves us.
Are you having anything to do with that? There's a festival, right? There's people doing a 20-year 20-year retrospective essentially. Are you hooking up with those individuals?
I've pitched the idea there. I'm in their Slack group. I'm not particularly active at the moment because of some of the things that I'm doing elsewhere, but it's I'm in contact with some of the trustees and the people that make the decision about that, and I think mine's being considered, so I'm hopeful that's a good forum to do so.
It seems like good of an opportunity to do that than anywhere else, considering the title. It's called a reflection on the Agile Manifesto 20 years on, or festival or something like that, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. And do you want to explain your I'm not even going to call it a bugbear, you've just brought to the surface different opinions about certification, and I know sometimes with these conversations it can be misconstrued. Sure. So from the person sparking that debate, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. So I think one of the best ways I can describe it at the moment is become a bit of a certification circus. There is some 264, I think, at the last check, different certifications relating to agility. Now, I'd love to say all of those were produced with the right ethical reasons behind them, but sometimes I do question whether there's a lot of profiteering going on. Adding the word agile to a topic and then making it into a course that can be sold and delivered, and then particularly when you then therefore get the renewal side of things come in as well, which to me is a particularly hot topic, because I think for me, unless the content of what you're teaching changes, why do you then have to renew it every year? Your knowledge hasn't changed. You don't have to retake an exam in many cases, and all that you're really doing is paying what is essentially like a mobile phone contract type subscription to maintain your shiny badge you get to put on your profile. And it doesn't really take into account the fact that you may have gained that learning from your 2-day course, whatever course it was. It's not really longitudinal, but your 2-day course, and then gone and applied that for 2 years. But then to prove that you can keep the course, you've got to pay a fee. So I'm not particularly a fan of that. And actually the outcome of me doing that challenge, and what I did was basically, I was talking about the certification circus, and I think I made a joke about, if I got every single safe certification, I would have a name longer than Daenerys Targaryen, Breaker of Chains, Mother of Dragons, etc. I'd be, POPM, SPC, etc., try and fit that in a coffee cup. But I basically challenged the Scrum Alliance, the Scrum Inc., SAFE on LinkedIn. And the outcome of that was that the CEO of Scrum Alliance reached out to me, and we ended up having a one-on-one Zoom call to talk about that situation, which I thought was a fantastic demonstration from Scrum Alliance of the first principle of the Agile Manifesto in customer centricity, because the CEO himself took it upon himself to speak to a customer and understand what the situation was. And I learned a lot of things from speaking to Howard.
I was going to say, I know you're releasing it separately, but did it change your opinion on anything, or I think, without giving the whole bit away, because I want people to watch that.
Sure. I mean, I won't give the full detail, of course, but I think there were some really positive outcomes. One of which was there was just an acknowledgement from the Scrum Alliance perspective that they hadn't told the story very well about what they are about, what they do. A few examples: they spent $5 million last year on various events they're entirely free community initiatives to try and promote agility in various places. They've invested in schooling and scholarship programs and all sorts of things like that. And they are entirely a not-for-profit. Their tax status means that they're not allowed to legally call the renewal process from Scrum Alliance a donation, which is essentially what it is, a donation rather than anything else, because it does go into paying for these community initiatives and maintaining their courseware. Another really positive thing that I think that came out of that conversation with Howard was his focus on longitudinal study. So that the Scrum Alliance is all about, yes, you'll have a course, whether it's 2 days to start you off, But then there are latter courses that you develop, and you have to gain what they call SEUs, Scrum Education Units. So it's a demonstration of ongoing learning, which is more the longitudinal side of things, where that comes in. And they're also going out to various recruitment and HR companies and educating them the differences between, a Scrum Master with a 2-day course and an Agile coach with X years of experience and what that is. Because they're seeing a dysfunction out in the industry where someone is labeling themselves an Agile coach perhaps a little bit prematurely, and that's kind of diluting the expectation of what an Agile coach really is.
Yeah. And I've just been thinking about it as you've been speaking. They all seem very American-centric. And I don't know, other people will be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but because of the workplace culture in America, Britain, everywhere else is quite different. I wonder if there is, or if there are ever plans to have like a, I don't know, Scrum Alliance London HQ, because a recruitment company in America would be very different to a recruitment company in Britain. And I don't even know if they have, distributed sort of HQs. I don't know. Just again,
don't know the answer to that question, but I'm certain you can ask.
Yeah, cool. So do you renew your certifications? Because that's what people will be.
I don't at all. And I actually, before meeting with Howard, I did some research. I put out some polls on both Slack and LinkedIn, asking questions like, have you ever lost a job opportunity as a consequence of not having an up-to-date certificate? And the answer to that question was 94%, sorry, it said no, they'd never lost or known someone to have lost an opportunity as a consequence of an expired certificate. So a lot of the companies out there are actually actively saying, one of the reasons, the benefits of certification is employability, but it was a crude, basically on a couple of hundred people worth of data. It was a bit crude, but that seems to suggest otherwise. The other question that was asked was around whether people did even renew their certifications, kind of a yes or no question. And that one came back a little bit more in favor. There was about 54% who did renew certifications versus 46% that didn't.
Yeah. For anyone outside the Agile space, I don't know if they would necessarily even know how to check if someone was in date or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know, maybe, surely you go on Scrum Alliance and just find out, but I don't know if it's as simple as that.
There is a search functionality on a lot of those websites to check an active certificate. But as I said, the data based on a raw study of a small sample size suggests that people aren't losing opportunities for those sorts of things. My CSM's Certified Scrum Master expired in 2015. I haven't renewed it since. I would challenge anyone to suggest that I'm not, good enough in Scrum or otherwise. So I don't think it's something that's ever impeded me getting a position.
Cool. Okay, we'll park that then for now. What about the dehumanizing workplace? And I'm going to loop back to that question. When I saw you post or tag those people with head of HR, yeah. I'm not going to lie, mate. I winced slightly because I wasn't sure whether you had thrown them under the bus without their permission.
That's a fair point, yeah.
So I wondered if you did ask their permission, and that's because you put a screenshot, and again, I'm not saying anything that no one knows because it's out there on your profile. So the context was you were talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the title potentially needs to change. Mm-hmm. Here's a group of people who have the title of head of HR. Yeah. And when I saw it, I was like, whoa, that's bold. So yeah, I wondered if you could explain a bit about that.
Absolutely. So this was all around a topic for me, which is one of my big frustrations, and I hear it so often in work, with new contracts, with every company I've ever worked for. You get people called resources, and that bothers me, right? Because that as a term dehumanizes people. It makes it easier to consider them as a avatar or just a name behind a screen. It turns them into a number, and numbers are easier to make unethical decisions about and not treat them humanely. If you think about that quote, they say that the death of one person is a tragedy, but the death of a million, I think it was Stalin, death of a million is just a statistic. And the whole dehumanization in the workplace comes down to the very fact that it's called an HR department, a human resources department. Now, to your point, I didn't check with each of those people that I could do this, and perhaps that was unfair of me. But at the same time, that information is publicly available. You do a search on LinkedIn, it's already there. So it's not like I'm actively calling them out specifically. And what I did in the post, I did mention that it wasn't about blaming you guys. And I said, if there's one outcome that I'm seeking from this, is that if one person reconsiders calling themselves an HR department, then that's been a positive for me.
Yeah, and I totally get your point. And I don't think I disagree with you. I just thought it was a bold move because, I don't know, using you as the example, your official title in your role is delivery lead, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you see yourself as an agile coach. Now, someone who's head of HR, day in, day out, might act in a very humane and empathetic way,
Mm-hmm.
but corporate culture, which is why you highlighted it, I suppose, dictates that they need this title. I'm not saying I disagreed with the post. I just thought it was very bold. If you hadn't have given them a heads up beforehand.
No, and I hadn't. I said, and that may be a failure on my part, but I'm not someone who's afraid of failing, right? If one of those people came to me and said, "Look, I'm sorry, you've been unfair to me there," I would have publicly apologized. That's
I can.
Right. But what I did see there was dysfunction, and it wasn't that I was just calling them out for the sake of calling them out. I was saying, right, here's a list of alternatives that other large tech companies, just like yourselves, are using. There's people operations. There's employee experience. You know, to mention Facebook and Airbnb. There's human capital. There's various different ones out there. So other companies are recognizing that actually that's probably outdated language now, and we're changing. And maybe it's just that others aren't aware of that yet.
Yeah, fair enough. Like I said, I totally agree. I just thought it was bold, but maybe that's what we need to spark change. So what's on the horizon? What have you got on the whiteboard for the next couple of weeks?
Next few weeks. So I've got a series of videos that I'm producing called Tales in the Trenches, which is all about kind of actionable hands-on experiences from an agile coaching perspective. Mm-hmm. So I did one last week, which was about how I became a Scrum Master. I've got one next week, which is all about failure, my biggest failure as an agile coach. There's various in that theme. I've got my weekly Agile Game of the Week posts, where I share agile games that I've seen work, and particularly virtual versions of those games. I translated, for example, there was a game on tastycupcakes.org, which was all about technical debts, and it was a physical game in person. I converted that to a virtual one using Miro. So there's that. I've got a talk on Wednesday, again, another version of the Agile Manifesto talk at the Expert Agile Club on Thursday this week. And then on the 22nd, I'm doing an experiment. I've basically created a concept called the Agile Arcade. And it's basically where people will come, and rather than a lot of the meetups you see out there with Agile games, where it's you kind of come to planning to play a specific game, I will put the onus on those attending to choose which game they want to play. So it'll be like an arcade game. Apparently I'm going to turn into a human console. I'm going to allow them to crowdsource the game they want to play. They're going to spend their tokens, as if you were in an actual arcade, and use that to vote which topics you want to do. And then we'll play the top games that people want to play.
And apart from LinkedIn, where is all this stuff so people can go to it? And I'll put it in the description.
So I've got my website is www.thevirtualagilecoach.co.uk. That's essentially my blog, alongside LinkedIn and alongside YouTube. Between those three is where all of my information goes. One of my values as the virtual agile coach is that it's open source content always. So there will be never anything I produce that's behind any sort of paywall.
And two questions. One, what are you reading at the moment, if anything? Any books on the go?
Yeah, so I've just finished up Leaders Eat Last by Simon Sinek. Currently reading the audio version of Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I've basically got a goal where I try and read 2 audiobooks a month, so I'm just churning through lots at the moment. I tend to do a kind of a work focus book, and then I do like a palette cleanser where I go into something fictitious just as a break, and then I go into another one again.
Yeah, cool. And that was it. If you're in a permanent role, right? Mm-hmm. What's the response like been from your employer being a bit more active? I don't know when you post. I don't. I don't stalk you that often, but
Yeah.
I'm assuming some of it's during the working day. Have they been supportive? Have they asked you, what you're doing? And the reason I ask is because a lot of contractors going into permanent positions, one of their fears is the lack of autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
So how has that been? Has there been any raised eyebrows?
No, there hasn't. And this is, in full credit to the company I'm working with. They provide me with a hell of a lot of autonomy. So I'm free to do as I please, to suggest experiments. I've got a line manager who's very supportive as to what I do. Obviously, I'm not just producing content for everyone. I'm producing it specific to their needs as well. So, and what I do actually is I produce a lot of my content ahead of time and then release it scheduled via things like Hootsuite. So those things do come out during work hours sometimes. Often they've been produced ahead of time.
Yeah, cool. Anything else you want to plug, mate? Again, there's no set agenda to this, so anything you want to push, go for it.
No, I mean, I'm not really one for self-promotional that much, to be honest. I'm just, I said, trying to be community-led, trying to be helpful as I can to share knowledge that I've got. I'm always, fearlessly open to challenging things. I've started a new series called AMA. You may be familiar if you're from the Reddit lore. But AMA just is blunt and open. Ask me anything you like. So if anyone has any sort of questions for me, I'll produce a personalized video response about it. Happy to do that. Yeah.
Cool.
I'm conscious I've spoken a lot. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts around some of these things.
Specification, I think I'm yet to hear a good alternative. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people talking about problems, but all right, brilliant. What should we do about it? Mm-hmm. Or what are you going, not as in you, but what is one going to do about it instead of just talking? So again, what's the alternative? I think there's some really good trainers out there making a difference in organizations, but I think with any industry there's going to be some snake oil people out there. Mm-hmm. I don't hear anyone complaining about Prince 2 or any of the other project management sort of certifications. It seems to be very agile heavy when there's a whole industry of certifications that have been going on for years and years. Mm-hmm. But I think the amount of certificating bodies is a bit of a joke. I can name probably 5 without even struggling. But again, I haven't necessarily got the answer to that because it's a free market at the end of the day. I think my only thing would be, I look more into the trainer than the certification. Like there's certain people I would probably invest in just to spend time with them. Sure. That's my thoughts on it.
That's fair. I think one of the reasons that the Agile Manifesto in particular is so important to me is because it's so foundational. You think that a lot of these training companies, they're going out there. One of the first things that if they're being honest with themselves and good about things, they should be starting with a manifesto. And if the manifesto is teaching principles which are, in some ways out of date by 20 years, that don't reflect 20 years of learning, we're teaching old information rather than the current reality. So that's one of the reasons I'm so hot on it in particular.
Yeah.
I think the other thing as well is that if we are seeing things that we as a community are not happy with, profiteering, focus on short-term learning as opposed to longitudinal, why don't we, as you say, do something about it and try and alter the manifesto to reflect? So maybe it's that a new principle is focused around empathy and understanding over profiteering. I don't know. I'm just throwing ideas out there. But if that was baked into what we believe in, and then we could start pushing back to some of these training providers and say, actually, we're seeing what you're doing here and we're not happy with it. We're not going to buy into it anymore. Just my thoughts.
Yeah, I'm not saying I disagree. I think, I haven't got an answer. The manifesto thing, I think, I think it should be revisited. I'd like to hear the people who actually wrote its perspective. So, Ken Beck, Ken Schwaber, Jeff Sutherland.
Yeah.
I'm not even going to try and list them all, but I'd like to hear them speaking about it as the people. As I've never watched a conversation like this.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they're out there. I probably just need to do a bit more research where someone asks the simple question of, what happened on that weekend.
Yeah.
I've never heard it. And if anyone can point me in that direction, and with someone who is actually there giving the answer, I would love to watch or listen to that. But yeah,
So
obviously
I've
need
done a bit of research on this actually. So basically, as you say, there's 17 gents that came together on that location in Utah.
very diverse.
Ski resort. Yeah, very diverse group of gents, all from software engineering backgrounds, and they created what they did. Now, if you think about what's happened since then, you've got Alistair Coburn, one of the creators, has got his own flavor of agility and called the Heart of Agile. And he's actively said that he doesn't like the manifesto. Perhaps I'm not quoting him word for word, but he thinks there's a lot of dysfunction there. You've got Jeff Sutherland's gone off and created Scrum Inc. and Scrum at Scale. You've got I can't remember the other one who's done SAFe. Dean Leffingwell. Dean Leffingwell's gone and done SAFe. So basically, they've gone and created these very conflicting frameworks that are all pushing their own version. Now, one of the questions that I would have to any of them is if any of those frameworks were truly agile, they would include somewhere in their implementation roadmap a checkpoint to say, do you know what? Is this framework even for you?
Yeah.
Yeah, and they don't do that. They push their own agenda.
And I think that's the point I'm sort of trying to make is it's great you and I talking about this stuff, but it's a bit like when you're in an organization and everyone in the room is talking about someone else who's not in the room.
Yeah.
So what we need to do is bring those people into the room. And I would like to think,
well,
if there's an online festival called Let's Look at the Agile Manifesto 20 years on, I would hope to think there is going to be input from at least 2 or 3 people who wrote that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, again, it's a group of people not involving the bloody people who are actually there and created it.
Well, this is my challenge also. I don't think it needs to be that way, right? To my understanding, people have approached those gents before and said, are we going to update this? And they've said categorically they have no intent to update it, okay? Now, my view on that is, and this is actually one of the things that I do personally, I measure and I gauge on whether a team or organization is self-organizing when they stop actively seeking my opinion for things and they just start creating things themselves. Now, what if the manifesto creators are doing that same experiment on all of us as practitioners and saying, do you know what, guys, we created something, but, self-organize and take it upon yourselves now. They're maybe not waiting for our input. Maybe they're just saying, we've learned a lot in 20 years. Why can't we create our own version? And I'm not saying that old version needs to be updated or changed. Historically, it's an artifact. It was great. But I am saying we should do that activity. We should do that retrospective and examine whether it is for us. And I don't think we need to wait for them to be involved. We can absolutely invite them. I would welcome it. I would shout out and say, guys, we'd love your input here. But at the same time, I think it should be community-led. It should be based on for the community, not a group of people who created 20 years ago.
And do you think that would, and it's fine if it would, do you think that would then spin off to other manifestos? Like how many manifestos would there be? Because I suppose their thinking is, and again, I don't know, the people in your community, for example, could do a retrospective and change to X, Y, and Z. The people in someone else's community don't agree with you, and then they come up with another one. Like maybe that's the answer. Maybe that's fine. Maybe every organization has its own Agile Manifesto. But I suppose that's why they're not going to change it, because it's the foundations for other people to evolve on. Yeah. Maybe there doesn't need to be a newer central one, if that makes sense.
And this is for me as part of that activity. It should be a community decision, right? Do we want various versions of it for different industries? Do we want to create our own version of Agile, our own manifesto for each company? If that's the answer, to me, that is actually being agility, because we're not holding a single document as Holy Bible. We're learning what works for us. We're experimenting and saying, actually, we prefer to work this way. That to me, as an Agile agnostic, that is actually more agile than just sticking to the one that was created 20 years ago. I think for me, the answer is, as a community, let's decide how the manifesto should serve us. And if that is the answer of, we'll have various different versions, great. If it's, we'll update a new version and that's our 2020 version and we'll stick to that, great. I don't know if it's that actually, it doesn't need to change at all. And if that's the answer, fine as well. It just means that we've practiced what we've preached and we've performed the inspection and adaptation activity.
Yeah, Gave my thoughts on certification, Agile Manifesto, dehumanizing work. Yeah, I totally agree. Resources are things you dig from the ground. They're not human beings that we burn. And I think as Scrum Masters, Agile coaches, people who work in the workplace, in the modern workplace, it goes beyond software development, and we need to be attacking this stuff with HR, with recruitment, with operations, throughout the organization. Doesn't just start, it probably starts with your software engineering team, but it needs to spread throughout.
I actually found for me, it starts with anyone, right? So if I'm in a meeting and I hear someone say resources, I'll first say, can I just clarify what you mean by that? And then they say, I meant people. And I say, can I ask you, can I request you please don't use that phrase? And this is the reason why. And then often they're like, oh yeah, I completely agree. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was doing it. And the problem is it's so ingrained a piece of language that people say it without thinking about it. And that becomes part of the problem. Historically, we could go back hundreds of years and think about poor uses of language where people have just become, a word or a phrase has become the norm just because, but it still dehumanizes a person just for using it, and doesn't treat them as equals. So for me, it's something that I will call out every time I hear it. I've taken to doing this on video calls when someone says it and they go, oh, sorry, Chris. And I've taken to typing it in messages and say resources, sad face. There's all sorts of little ways, but it's just trying to embed that habit of, and also not just making it about myself. Say, if you hear it, guys, say it as well. Challenge anyone else you hear saying it, because that's how it spreads. It's not just about me calling out. And I've done this to CTOs, to CIOs, whoever, C-suite people. Say that if you want to commit to being a forward-thinking company that cares about its people, we're not resources. No one wants to wake up in the morning and be told, oh, I'm just a resource, I'm going to go and be chucked onto that project.
And how do you deal with individuals who just, not rightly or wrongly really, who just don't see a problem with it? It's just a word, and who just don't see a problem with it really. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so I would say that's in my experience fewer and further between, but it does absolutely happen. There are some people who will say things like, oh yeah, that's just political correctness and so on and so forth. And they'll challenge why you're even bothering about it, because it doesn't really matter. I would say that I respect your opinion here, but ultimately it's about what other people think, not what about you think. So if you've got people that are disheartened, demotivated by being called a resource, then you should take a responsibility, just like with Black Lives Matter, to educate yourselves on the socially acceptable use of language and try and challenge your own thinking about things. Don't just accept it because that's the way it always was.
Yeah, fair point. Valid point.
Approach it with empathy. Try and understand why they don't think for this an issue, and just start from a listening and understanding perspective. But then I'm not going to force my opinion on them, but I'm going to invite them to say, how would you feel if you were being called a word that you weren't happy with?
Yeah, fair enough. Cool. I think we've pretty much covered everything, Chris, to be honest.
I think so.
You're quite happy for people to connect with you on LinkedIn and
always
all that stuff. Is that the best place to get you?
Yeah, connect me with me on LinkedIn. Challenge me on any topics you see. I don't mind. I love a debate. Please do.
Cool. Thanks very much for your time.
All right, it's a pleasure.